Welcome to Talking Ketamine, episode 12. If you're tuning in, maybe you've experienced ketamine yourself in a therapeutic setting, perhaps, and you're wondering what exactly it's doing in the brain, especially how it stacks up against other treatments.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We want to unpack the science, behind how ketamine works for depression and look at what the research suggests about potential long-term benefits from therapeutic use.
Right, and it's crucial to separate that from the risks, the potential health outcomes linked to heavy recreational use.
Absolutely. We'll get into how it interacts with your brain chemistry, compare it to, well, the more traditional approaches, and also shine a light on what long-term misuse might look like.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The big question. How does ketamine actually work for depression? Our sources call it mechanistically novel and rapidly acting. What does that mean in plain English?
Well, think about typical antidepressants. They often take weeks, right? And target maybe one or two chemical systems. Ketamine's different. Its main action, the headline act, is blocking these things called NMDRRs, N-methyl D-aspartate receptors.
Okay, NMDRs, like switches in the brain.
Kinda, yeah. Important ones. By temporarily blocking them, ketamine triggers this rapid cascade of downstream effects. It's quite a chain reaction.
So it's not just hitting one specific target.
Not solely, no. While the NMDR block is key, ketamine is a bit of a multitasker. It also sort of nudges other systems, GABA, opioid, serotonin, even acetylcholine and dopamine receptors, though its connection to those is generally weaker, less direct. But this broader action probably contributes to why it feels and works differently and so fast.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we always hear about serotonin and depression, the monoamine theory. Does ketamine fit into that picture at all?
It's an interesting link. You know how SSRIs work by boosting serotonin? Well, some preclinical evidence suggests ketamine might also increase serotonin between nerve cells, possibly by inhibiting its reuptake, a bit like an SSRI, but through different means, perhaps.
So there's an overlap there.
There seems to be. Animal studies have even shown that if you deplete serotonin, ketamine's antidepressant effects can actually be reduced. So serotonin definitely seems to be part of the story, even if not the main driver of the speed.
Different paths potentially leading to more serotonin availability?
Possibly, yeah. But there's likely more going on. Some animal research points towards ketamine triggering serotonin release, specifically in the medial prefrontal cortex, a key mood area. And this seems to happen via activating other receptors, AMPA receptors, which then boosts pathways involved in, well, strengthening connections between brain cells.
Synaptogenesis, like helping the brain physically build new connections.
That's the idea. It's less about just adjusting chemical levels moment to moment and more about maybe prompting structural changes, potentially.
Wow, okay. And what about dopamine? That's linked to reward, motivation.
Dopamine's role is still a bit fuzzy, honestly. There was one mouse study suggesting that activating certain dopamine receptors in that same prefrontal cortex area produced antidepressant effects. And blocking those specific receptors seemed to block ketamine's effects too. So it suggests dopamine's involved somehow, but pinning down exactly how his ongoing work.
It sounds way more complex than I initially thought. But the sources stress that these effects on individual chemicals, like serotonin or dopamine, don't fully explain why ketamine works so quickly.
That's the really crucial bit. Your standard antidepressants, the SSRIs, TCAs, they take weeks, right? Because they rely on slower changes in those monoamine systems. Ketamine can bring relief within hours for some people. That speed strongly suggests that the initial NMDR block and the immediate downstream effects, maybe involving glutamate signaling, are really central to its rapid action.
Which brings us to comparing ketamine with those older treatments. What are the key differences someone should know?
Speed is number one,
Mhm.
and often efficacy, especially in treatment-resistant cases. Ketamine frequently shows greater effectiveness, and that's significantly faster onset compared to SSRIs or TCAs.
And the side effects? Short term, anyway.
Generally considered more tolerable in the immediate short term for many compared to the initial side effects of starting an SSRI sometimes. Things like dissociation pass quickly.
But there's a flip side, right? The effects don't last as long.
That's the main trade-off, yes. The antidepressant effect from a single ketamine infusion is usually shorter-lived than the sustained effect of a daily pill. This often means repeated treatments are needed.
And accessibility, the need for clinical supervision.
Right, it's a different delivery model entirely, not just popping a pill at home.
What about comparing it to ECT, electroconvulsive therapy? That's sometimes used for very severe depression.
Yeah, that's an important comparison. For severe non-psychotic depression, studies suggest ketamine can be similarly effective to ECT. Some research even hints ketamine might offer faster relief in some cases and potentially, importantly, fewer long-term cognitive side effects.
Fewer cognitive side effects would be a huge plus for many people considering ECT.
Definitely. But we need a balanced view. One study did find ECT superior overall for symptom reduction and remission rates. This might be because ECT is particularly effective for depression with psychosis, where ketamine's role is less clear.
So it depends on the specific situation.
It seems so. Another study actually found ketamine was not inferior to ECT for non-psychotic depression, meaning it worked about as well. So it's definitely emerging as a viable, perhaps less invasive alternative in many cases.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. What's the actual experience like during or right after a therapeutic ketamine session? What are those common transient side effects?
People often report feeling a bit disconnected, maybe spacey or woozy. That's the dissociation. Visual changes can happen, like things looking a bit strange or distorted. Also, increases in blood pressure and sometimes intracranial pressure are possible, along with maybe nausea, headache, dizziness, drowsiness, or even some anxiety right afterwards.
That blood pressure increase, how serious is that usually?
It varies. Some studies report only minor, clinically insignificant bumps. Others have seen more substantial increases that, in some individuals, might briefly require medication to manage. But the key is, these increases are generally transient, meaning they don't last long, and they're monitored closely during treatment.
And the dissociation, the sort of psychedelic-like feelings people describe, feeling strange, fluty.
Yes, those are very characteristic, feeling weird, loopy out of body, seeing patterns, feeling numb. It's a range of unusual sensations. But again, these are typically short-lived, fading within a couple hours post-treatment.
What about thinking and memory? Any short-term impact there from therapeutic use?
The research is a little mixed on that. Some studies suggest temporary issues with working memory, like holding information in your head or encoding new information right after a session. But other studies haven't consistently found significant impairments. So it's something researchers are still looking closely at, the immediate cognitive effects.
Okay, that paints a good picture of the therapeutic side. Now, let's tackle that crucial distinction, the potential long-term effects and risks tied to heavy, non-therapeutic ketamine use.
Yes, this is really important to differentiate. Heavy, often recreational use is a different scenario entirely from controlled medical administration, and it carries different, potentially serious risks. Regulatory bodies like the FDA noticed concerns back in the 70s, and it became more prominent in Europe in the 90s.
The sources mention different patterns of recreational use, like injecting versus snorting powder.
Right. Users are broadly grouped. Some inject liquid ketamine, often seeking more intense dissociative or psychedelic effects. Others use powdered ketamine intranasally, maybe in social settings, which can sometimes feel more stimulant-like. These different patterns might carry slightly different risk profiles, too.
And tolerance. Can people need more and more over time?
Oh, definitely. Tolerance can develop with frequent use. There's a case study of a nurse who was self-treating depression and significantly escalated her dose over time just to get the same effect.
Did she have problems stopping?
Interestingly, in that specific case, after stopping for 14 weeks under supervision, she apparently withdrew without detectable long-term issues. But it clearly shows how tolerance can drive dose escalation.
Which leads to the question of addiction. Can heavy ketamine use become addictive?
The potential is there, yes. It's thought that the pleasant dissociative feelings, combined with ketamine's effects on dopamine and possibly opioid receptors, can activate the brain's reward circuitry.
Brain imaging studies support this idea.
Yes. One study linked mood improvements after ketamine to increased activity in reward-related areas, parts of the prefrontal cortex, the substantia nigra, VTA, nucleus accumbens, classic reward pathway stuff. So the theory is ketamine might hijack these pathways. For someone with depression, it might boost reward signals and simultaneously dull the brain's overreaction to negative things, potentially creating a cycle that encourages more use.
What about withdrawal? Do heavy users experience symptoms when they stop?
Some recreational users do report things like palpitations, anxiety, shaking, sweating when they cease use. But, and this is a key distinction again, studies looking specifically at depression, patients stopping therapeutic ketamine haven't found evidence of a distinct withdrawal syndrome. It really highlights the difference between the use patterns.
Okay, now let's get into some specifics from studies on long-term heavy users. What kind of problems have been observed?
One major finding relates to spatial memory deficits, so problems remembering where things are, navigating environments. Brain scans of these heavy users showed reduced activity in the hippocampus and parahippocampal gyrus areas, crucial for navigation and memory when they tried to recall routes.
So it actually impacts their ability to navigate and remember places.
It seems so. They also showed less activation in the caudate nucleus when updating memories. And interestingly, the severity of schizotypal symptoms, like unusual thoughts or perceptions and dissociation, were linked to how much less active their hippocampus was.
What's the theory behind that? Why would ketamine damage spatial memory?
One hypothesis is that chronic ketamine might disrupt inhibitory cells, GABAergic interneurons, in the hippocampus. This could lead to overexcitation, kind of like stressing out the place cells that map our environment, causing damage and impairing spatial memory.
And you mentioned a link to schizotypal symptoms, like schizophrenia-like experiences.
Yeah, the researchers suggested this hippocampal dysfunction in heavy users might be connected to those symptoms, possibly through knock-on effects on dopamine systems, which we know are involved in psychosis. It's a concerning potential link.
There was also a study looking at when someone starts using heavily adolescence versus adulthood. What did that find?
Really important findings there. It showed lower gray matter volume, basically, less brain tissue in a region called the precuneus in ketamine users compared to non-users. And critically, this reduction was larger in the group who started using as adolescents.
So starting young during that key brain development period might lead to more significant structural changes.
That's what the data suggests, yes. The study also found reduced gray matter in other areas like the insula, parietal lobe, and prefrontal cortex in ketamine users generally. It reinforces that heavy use can impact brain structure, and adolescent brains might be particularly vulnerable.
We should also briefly mention the urinary tract issues, right? Ketamine cystitis.
Yes, that's a well-documented and sometimes severe side effect of chronic, high-dose recreational use, particularly highlighted in studies from Asia. It causes significant bladder pain and damage. It's not typically associated with supervised therapeutic use at standard doses, but it's a serious risk with misuse.
And finally, overdose risk.
It's crucial to note that most fatal or near-fatal incidents involving ketamine aren't just from ketamine alone. They usually involve polydrug use, mixing ketamine with alcohol, opioids, or other sedatives. That combination dramatically increases the danger.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what are the main takeaways for someone listening who's curious about ketamine?
I'd say first, ketamine offers genuinely rapid antidepressant effects via complex brain mechanisms. It's a promising tool, especially for treatment-resistant depression when used therapeutically. But second, it's absolutely vital to distinguish this from long-term, heavy, unsupervised use. That pattern carries real risks: cognitive impairment, especially spatial memory, potential links to psychiatric symptoms, and even structural brain changes.
And starting young might make those risks worse.
The evidence points that way, yes. Early exposure seems potentially more impactful.
So it leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? Given these very distinct profiles for therapeutic versus heavy recreational use, what are the most critical things we need to consider to make sure we're using ketamine safely and effectively for mental health? Balancing that incredible potential against the clear risks seems key.
Absolutely. It's all about context, dose, frequency, and supervision.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for breaking that all down for us today.